Welcome to the American Jewish Philanthropic Complex, a conversation between Lila, Corwin, Berman, and Rob Reich about the past, present, and future of American Jewish giving. I'm Allison Schachter, the chair of the Department of Jewish Studies at Vanderbilt University, and this event is a collaboration between Jewish Studies at Vanderbilt, the Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, and the Jewish Philanthropy Research Initiative. It is one of the upsides of virtual programming that makes this exciting collaborative event possible, all on a variety of different time zones. So I also wanted to let everyone know that the newly instituted Jewish Philanthropy Initiative, with support from the Lippman-Kanfer Foundation for Living Torah, will continue these conversations with a larger conference to take place the coming academic year at the Katz Center. So please check the Katz Center website for more information about this upcoming conference. I want to thank the Katz Center staff who helped make this program possible, including Deanna Dennis-Walters, the events coordinator, Brian Lipscomb, IT specialist, Becky Friedman, communications coordinator, and Ann Albert, director of public programs. And I also want to thank Sydney Grimes, the administrator in the Department of Jewish Studies at Vanderbilt, for her help. Shaul Kellner, associate professor of Jewish Studies and Sociology at Vanderbilt, will lead the Q&A in the second portion of this event. And I want to let you know now that if you have questions, please use the question and answer feature on Zoom to submit them. And you can submit them during the course of the conversation. You don't need to wait until the end. So it's my pleasure to introduce our two speakers today. Lila Corwin Berman is professor of history at Temple University. She holds the Murray Friedman Chair of American Jewish History and directs the Feinstein Center for American Jewish History. She is author of the American Jewish Philanthropic Complex, The History of a Multi-Billion-Dollar Institution, Princeton, 2020, Metropolitan Jews, Politics, Race, and Religion in Post-War Detroit from the University of Chicago in 2015, and Speaking of Jews, Rabbis, Intellectuals, and the Creation of an American Public Identity from the UC Press, 2009. Her work has received support from the National Endowment of the Humanities and the American Council of Learned Societies, and her first book was a finalist for the Jewish Book Council's Sammy Rohr Prize. Her articles have appeared widely in such journals as American Historical Review, the Journal of American History, and Jewish Social Studies, and she has also written guest columns for the Washington Post, The Forward, and Jewish Week. She serves as the chair of the Academic Council of the American Jewish Historical Society and as a fellow of the American Academy of Jewish Research. Currently, Berman is a fellow at the Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. Our second speaker, Rob Reich, is professor of political science and, by courtesy, professor of philosophy at Stanford University. He's the director of the Center for Ethics and Society and co-director of the Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society and associate director of the Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence. His scholarship engages with the work of social scientists and engineers, and he is also the author of Just Giving, Why Philanthropy is Failing Democracy and How It Can Do Better, Princeton University Press, 2018, Philanthropy and Democratic Societies, Histories, Institutions, Values, edited with Chiara Cordelli, Lucy Bernholtz at the University of Chicago Press in 2016. He's also the author of several books on education, including Bridging Liberalism and Multiculturalism in American Education, University of Chicago, 2002, and Education, Justice, and Democracy, University of Chicago, 2013. His newest work is on ethics and technology, and he has not one, but two books coming out in 2021, Digital Technology and Democratic Theory, edited with Lucy Bernholtz and Helene Landemore with University of Chicago, and System Error, Where Big Tech Went Wrong and How We Can Reboot, with Mehran Sahami and Jeremy Weinstein at HarperCollins. And he has written for the New York Times, Washington Post, Wired, and the Stanford Social Innovation Review. Now, finally, before we begin our talk, I want to let everybody know that Princeton University Press is offering a discount on both Professor Corman's book, The American Jewish Philanthropic Complex, and Professor Reich's Just Giving, Why Philanthropy is Failing Democracy, and you can find the discount code in the chat. So it's a pleasure. I turn it over to the stage to you two, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you so much, Lila. It's great to see you again and have a chance to talk about your fantastic book. Congratulations on such a terrific accomplishment.
Thank you.
I thought I'd start our conversation just by saying something chiefly for the benefit of the audience who's joined in, especially if you don't happen to be a scholar or an academic and you're wondering what it is to write as a scholar about the topic of philanthropy, because I think in offering the following comment, I'll help convey at least my understanding about what makes your book, Lila, such an important accomplishment beyond just the mere fact of a really good scholarly achievement. And then I've got lots of questions for you, Lila. So with your indulgence for a minute, I think I'll just frame for people this larger conversation, which is the following. At universities, for all of you who have passed through them, you're well aware that there are institutional organizations, or basically the organizational structure of universities allows for business schools as well as, to some extent, econ departments, where the chief task of scholars there is to study the operation in large respect of the marketplace and to train the next generation of corporate leaders, particularly in business schools. And in somewhat parallel form, if you looked at universities, you'd often find a school of public policy or a political science department or a public policy department, where the task of scholars there is to study the operation of government agencies or democratic institutions, and to train the next generation of leaders in government or in public service. Strangely, universities aren't organized in such a way as to devote scholarly attention and leadership training in general to the third sector or independent sector, the space in between the market and government that often gets called civil society. And so as a result, scholars who write about topics in philanthropy or civil society or nonprofits are often sort of scattered across the entire university, rarely brought together in some sort of common community. And one of the things which I prize about Lila's work is that it's able, from the standpoint within the discipline of history, to bring to bear an orientation on the question of Jewish philanthropy in particular, not as a kind of siloed, isolated phenomenon, but connected to the broader sweep of understanding American history, both in its marketplace and political development. In other words, it's a piece of scholarship that speaks to the full breadth of interests in philanthropy, not just as an isolated phenomenon. And that's what I think is so important about new programs within universities that try to draw together scholars in a similar orientation, independent of whatever their disciplinary roots happen to be. Okay, well, with that as a kind of framing, Lila, I thought I'd start with the following question that sort of you motivate your book. That philanthropy is often understood as something that happens.
You know what, Rob, you're dropping out a little bit, and I know you had something you were going to do if that happened.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
I can hear you, yeah.
You can hear me. All right, well, I'm going to try for a minute, go back on. I want to get at least the first question in.
Okay.
Okay. Lila, am I still good?
I can hear you, yes.
Okay. One of the things that people often see is something that happens sort of on the sidelines of life. And that's to say, most of what we understand about the economy. And secondly, that there's, of course, the government itself, which is a big center of spending and attention. And you write that your life, and in fact, most people's lives, are touched in a daily way, in some respect, by philanthropy. So far from being something that happens on the sideline, it's a ubiquitous phenomenon. It's a common feature that impacts our ordinary lives in powerful ways. I thought that was a powerful way of suggesting why we should put philanthropy at the center of an analysis rather than on the margins or the periphery of an analysis. And I wanted to just see if you could expand upon that initial framing or motivation in the book as a way of setting up the conversation.
Yeah, I like how you asked that, actually, because, I think it is often the case, and I've had conversations about the book with various people who work in philanthropy and who say, look, we're downstream from the private sector and from government, right? So, in a sense, fine, if you want to study some of the ways that the private sector or the government might operate, maybe you'll see them kind of manifested as if it's, the progeny of them through philanthropy. But philanthropy itself is not really at the center of something. And I have, through the research I've done and the thinking, really come to think of philanthropy as occupying a much bigger kind of role in American civil society and in American life. And that it's not just that, well, maybe we glimpse a little bit of the state or a little bit of the private sector through philanthropy, but that in a sense, philanthropy has been a certain kind of engine that pulls the two together, right? And there's a lot in kind of, early Republic political theory that was even really thinking about that, right? What is it that's not the individual and it's not the state and it's these things in between, and that will be kind of the sinews that tie together the market and democracy. And to me, that's why philanthropy was suddenly so fascinating, right? It was not something I had thought about very much, although, as I say, I realized it was constantly touching my life. But once I sort of realized the space that it occupied and how much not only was it a lens to see these other things, but it was like a place where a lot of ideas about public and private were forged, I realized that I really wanted to pay a great deal of attention to it.
Great. Well, so I just agree wholeheartedly with the basic orientation there. Of course, I come from personally from a different disciplinary orientation or lens. I'm a political scientist, in particular, a political theorist or philosopher, not an historian. But I think there is something additional that my own thinking about philanthropy shares with you. And I want to see if I can get you to put it in your own words here for everyone as it's expressed in your book. One other common background assumption is that philanthropy is sort of a quintessentially private activity, or just the exercise of someone's liberty to do what they want with their own money. It doesn't have implications for the state in any powerful way or the market necessarily. It's what happens after you get your marketplace winnings or earnings, and now you've got a bunch of stuff and you decide to be altruistic and give it away. But you think, as do I, that there are various ways in which the government shapes and in fact subsidizes the activity of philanthropy. And that as a consequence, it's not exactly a private activity at all. So can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, and actually it was a line of your writing. It was something I was thinking a lot about as I was doing this research. And in the book that Princeton has generously agreed to give people a discount on, so I suggest you buy it. You use this phrase where you say something like philanthropy is not an invention, but it's an artifact of the state. And that was like a real aha moment for me, because I realized at that point that, this relationship, right? People think I make my own decisions about charitable giving. It's my altruism or my generosity or my obligation, whatever it might be. But it's actually a moment when you are in deep relationship with the state, like as deep of a relationship as when on April 15th, when you pay your taxes, right? And that in fact, the reason it became so interesting to me is because a lot of the historical scholarship on American Jews has been framed by this sense that when Jews came to the United States and were emancipated immediately into full citizenship, right? This is how the narrative has gone. They had an individual relationship with the American state. They were citizens, but they were not regarded in any collective fashion by the American state. And that this was wholly different from their experience, especially in Europe, where, whether or not they were formally emancipated, they were still seen as a collective, that was a kind of status-based society. And this was such a clear way of seeing the ways in which Jews, not simply as individuals, but as members of different kinds of collectives, were being seen by the state, were being supported and disciplined by the state. And, to me, that was like an important kind of rethinking about the position of Jews as a collective in the United States. It allowed me to ask really different questions about the experience of American Jews.
Yeah, great. Let's try and be specific about that. So for any of you on listening and you kind of study or think about this at some level of detail, none of what I think is about to be said will be surprising. But in case you're hearing what Lila just said and you think, supported and disciplined by the state. Whoa, like what do you mean by that? Like, so what are we talking about in terms of supports and discipline from the state? Can you give some particular examples?
Yeah, so I think a really good way to think about it is by thinking about religion in this country, right? So we all learn that there is a separation of church and state in the United States, right? That there is no established religion. But in fact, what happens in the United States first in individual states and then on a federal level, is that there is a relationship between religion and the state in the United States. And it works in the following way, that once there is a church or a synagogue or a mosque that is formed and that is incorporated, it gains a certain kind of visibility. So it gets a status in the eyes of the state. And so it can be seen in a way. So visibility is the first thing. The second thing is that it gets certain kinds of privileges, right? Once it is incorporated as a religious entity. Same if you're incorporated as a charitable entity or some kind of scientific or educational entity, right? You get certain kinds of privileges because the assumption is that you are now a public-oriented entity, right? So you're not the same as the government, but you're public oriented. And so one of the main privileges you get is that you will not face most forms of taxation. So this started, in the early 19th century in various states that would exempt churches from property taxation, right? And the idea was that, although no, they were not established, so they weren't formally part of the state the way that the Church of England was formally part of England. They were still on that public side. And so it almost would have been a kind of double taxation if you had taxed their property, and that they maybe wouldn't have been able to survive if you had done so, right? So in getting that exemption from paying different kinds of tax, it's fair to think about that also as the state supporting that institution, right? So if you're a synagogue and you own a certain amount of property, or you hold a certain amount of money and you're making income on that money through interest, you're not being taxed on that. And there are ways of thinking about then as a kind of tax expenditure, right? That is the government saying, we're not going to take that revenue, we're not going to take that money into our revenue stream. But what's the discipline then? Well, the discipline is that in order to get that support, there are things you need to do, right? So in the early 19th century, for example, when churches were given property tax exemption from states, they often were limited in terms of the amount of property they could own. They were also told that there had to be a board put in place that was a kind of fiduciary board made up of lay people, right? So this was some concern about clergy, maybe having too much power, and that there should be a lay board that was in, that had some control, right? So there's different ways that the state can both offer this support, but in offering the support, I think about it like parenting a little bit sometimes, right? In offering the support, you also then create a relationship of dependency, right? And so then there's certain things we know about, in more kind of current debates, that clergy are not supposed to get up on the, bima, if it's a synagogue or in front of the congregation, wherever they are, and say who people should vote for. Right. That's another form of discipline because of this kind of relationship.
Yeah, let's dwell on that last bit there for a second, because far beyond the experience of Jews in the United States, the intertwining of religion and politics is featured in any history of any other country as well. So think, for example, of Martin Luther King and the mobilization of the Black church on behalf of civil rights. So let's just be specific about the disciplining that you have in mind there. What's your best understanding of the evolution of this kind of division between church and state, but as we institutionalize and incorporate religious bodies, there is, just as you said, a political ban on formal electioneering activities. A lot of philanthropy has a political valence, and just as I said, even a lot of religious philanthropy has a political valence, even in the face of this law or institutional discipline against formal electioneering. So can you say a bit more about that complex terrain in the history that you've written?
Yeah, absolutely. This was so interesting to me. And I have to say that some of my interest in trying to figure out the political space that American Jewish philanthropic institutions operated in came from current conversations I had with people who worked in the sector. Because as I was working on this book, I was doing all sorts of archival research, but I also kind of made it my business to just talk to people who worked in American Jewish philanthropy. And one of the recurring things that folks would say to me who worked in the sector was that they always know they're doing really well when they have the left yelling at them and the right yelling at them, right? And at first I was like, oh, haha, that's cute, and then you hear it like 5 more times and you start to say, well, what is behind that, right? Like, why is it so important to be posturing in this way of being politically neutral? And so part of that does have to do with the evolution of these ideas of discipline and support, right? So that, part of the theory of how this kind of middle space of philanthropy, neither private nor public, worked is that it was supposed to be a check both on the power of the majority, right? And too much power of like a despotic, tyrannical state. And so there was a sort of sense that it was good to have some power in these different associations or kind of collective entities. But it could also be dangerous, right? Yes. You could imagine that if a church suddenly gained a lot of power, a lot of money, and was then able to tell all of its adherents what to think about things and who to vote for and so on and so forth, it could actually come into a position of being able to replace the state, right? Right. And so part of the idea as, especially, we can look at the late 19th century, early 20th century, as a federal income tax code is being put together at that period after the Civil War, looking for these new kinds of revenue streams to help sew together some kind of centralized sense of a nation. And there's an exemption clause put in there, right? That all these certain kinds of charitable and educational institutions will not be taxed. But part of the assumption was that they wouldn't interfere with the work of governing. But the language was not particularly clear, right? That they shouldn't make propaganda was kind of the language. And, as happens, there's certain times when there are people who start to, or institutions who start to get into the business that some legislators say, hey, they're taking over what is government work. Yes. So one of these cases in the early 1930s, it has to do with a guy who gave money to a birth control league organization. And this was after the personal individual exemption was passed in 1917, he goes to submit his taxes and he wants an exemption because he gave money to a charitable organization. And the Revenue Bureau at the time says, no, you don't get the exemption because this is a birth control league and they are lobbying for specific kinds of legislation. Yes. And the courts say, you know what, it's not clear. It's actually not clear what you're saying that these entities are not allowed to do. And so there's a change in tax code in the 30s that organizations that are marked as charitable, what we would know today as nonprofits or 501c3s, are not allowed to be involved in substantial legislative, a great lawyerly term, substantial legislative lobbying. Okay, so that gives it some clarity. Then again, in the 1950s, there's, I think in the context of growing suspicion, this is the era of McCarthyism. What does it mean for these kind of quasi-public, quasi-private groups to have power, to have subsidy from the government? Are they potentially subversive? And there are hearings in Congress about this question. And from the floor, there's an amendment to change tax code that was introduced by then Senator Johnson, who says that we should also make sure that these entities do not engage in electioneering, right? Yes. Do not campaign for people who are running for office. And there's an idiosyncratic backstory that I think he was in a rancorous campaign and had felt like his opponent was getting all these charitable entities to kind of work on his behalf. And Johnson was not happy about that. But it's all part of this kind of effort, in a sense, to constrain what philanthropic organizations can do. But it's also a really peculiarly narrow definition of what is political. Yes. And that, to me, became really interesting, because I just told you that no, substantial legislative lobbying and don't get involved in electioneering.
Yes.
And that becomes kind of all that is political.
Right.
And yet you can still be saying, we're not political. Look, we have this 501c3. So that became a really interesting piece of the puzzle to me.
Yeah, super. All right, I want to dwell for one more question, one more exchange in the history that you tell, since that's, as I said, the distinctive disciplinary orientation you bring. Then I want to shift to some provocations and criticisms, less of the book than of philanthropy and potentially Jewish philanthropy as such, because your book is also critical. So I think we'll be in some common territory there. But first on the history. So I like the kind of chronological proceeding of the book, or the way it unfolds. And just as you said at the start, that civil society and nonprofits and philanthropy is this connective tissue between individuals or family life and then the government, the distant further state. And the history of American civil society, when we go all the way back, say, to the Federalist Papers or de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, or later iterations of it, there are many interesting episodes you recount in the book about the distinctive philanthropic traditions in Judaism here in the United States that are intertwined with the story of American civil society writ large. And I can think of at least two important ones, and I want to ask you to either talk about these or expand on any others you want. So the first is the Jewish Federation as a particular type of associational structure. And one of the stories for anyone who's paid attention to the so-called decline of American civic life or trust in American life probably knows Robert Putnam's famous book from about 15 or 20 years ago called Bowling Alone, which partly identifies the problem of American civic life today as the slow disappearance of federated or associational organizations. And second, I wanted to get you to say something about donor-advised funds, which are, I would call them the kudzu of American philanthropy today, kind of absorbing enormous sources of philanthropic assets and wealth and choking off the lifeblood of actual service-delivering nonprofits. And donor-advised funds have become, in my judgment, a genuine problem in American civil society today. And they have an interesting tether in your own telling of the story.
Yeah, so federations are really important in the history of American Jewish philanthropy. And, in a sense, in the history of American philanthropy, the kind of model that Jews who come to the United States bring of having this sort of communal or like semi-autonomous kind of collective organization to support their own agencies, in a sense, their own forms of social welfare, becomes, it's not the only model, and there were other models that preceded it, but I think it does become, and you can read various correspondence where folks who get involved in forming Catholic charities and the United Way, right, first Community Chest and then the United Way, are actually looking at the structure that American Jews form. And it's, a structure of a kind of umbrella type of organization that pulls together in a geographically based way a number of agencies in any given city. And it says, for the sake of efficiency, instead of each one of you raising your own money and potentially competing with one another, we should centralize this. And we should raise money from a community of people who are interested and who would care and be concerned. And then we will dole that out, and we'll, continue this kind of practice, and you can plan then, because you'll know that this money is coming in. And this is happening at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, the same time that actually very similar stuff is happening in terms of the structure of American federal government as well, right? This is this kind of time of centralization of an interesting kind of centralized and efficient revenue generation and distribution. And by the 1920s, lots and lots of different American cities have these Jewish federations. And there's, in its own right, there's a really interesting history of kind of shifting away from a model that was often a more feminized, kind of benevolent, charitable model, moving it toward a more professionalized, tended to be more male model, unseating some of the women who had been leading these organizations, Sometimes making decisions about organizations that aren't going to be part of the federation and don't make the cut, right? So this was not just like this kumbaya moment of everybody coming together and just agreeing. And there are, you can tell that there are lots of failed experiments because the names of these federations change over and over and over. We know when institutions change names, it means something is not going well in a sense, right? But there is a kind of sense that the basic technology of these federations was that every year money would come in and that money would go out.
Right.
And that became the kind of legitimating act that people would see where that money went and what it did. And then they could decide to give again because they thought basically it was doing the right thing.
Right.
And there were written into the bylaws of federations as they were forming rules about not withholding capital from circulation.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, saying that they were not going to have endowments, they were not going to have, big reserve funds, that the money was meant to come in and go out like a revolving door to meet immediate material needs.
Right.
And in fact, in some of the papers I read, it's almost like there is this sense of needing to really distinguish themselves from Rockefeller and Carnegie and what they call the big charity trust foundations.
Yes.
Right. And that's part of the kind of critique, the progressive era critique against the Gilded Age. And, and as Jews in particular, not wanting to be associated with accumulating capital in that way. And one of the major shifts that happens in the 20th century that I trace in the book has to do with the unlearning of that rule, right? Mm-hmm. And what the kind of cultural shift meant.
Yep.
Because anybody who is here listening and who knows, much of anything about how Jewish or just American philanthropy works, will know that endowment building, right, holding back capital,
right,
has become, if it's not the practice of a particular philanthropy, it's what they all think they should be doing.
Yep.
And this is a major shift that happens, and in this federated structure, it happens after the Second World War for a number of different reasons that include the fact that there aren't the same kinds of immediate material domestic needs that American Jews are facing, right? And Jews have gained socioeconomic power. They have more money, they're more affluent, so there's capital, right? But there aren't necessarily the same needs. And there's, a kind of growing sense that the real problems that American Jewish philanthropy can address are less the material need problems and more these kind of identity issues, right? And part of the shift, and I'll end here and then we can talk about donor advised funds if you want. Part of the shift, though, involves creating new technologies, right? If the central technology was about distribution, what kind of technology has to be created so that the kind of act of philanthropy can appear to be fulfilled without distribution, instead with accumulation? And this is one of the major shifts that happens. And one of the ways it happens is through the creation of these things called donor advised funds, which are these kind of like semi-private foundations that are held in public charities. And I'm happy to talk more about them, but I don't want to read out my whole book. So let me hand it back to you.
Well, I'm curious, especially how you see the history of donor advised funds connected with the evolution of Jewish philanthropy in particular, since these days, I think the ordinary, in my neck of the woods in Silicon Valley, the newly wealth of your early employee who stuffs his or her money into a donor advised fund doesn't know anything about the history of the donor advised funds. They just see it as a vehicle suggested to them by a wealth advisor as a way of immediately getting the upfront tax benefits of sheltering from taxation, a kind of liquidity event or a big wealth accumulation, and then trickling out the door at any time they like in the future, the money to an operating charity. How did these evolve from within your own historical study into the things that they are today, almost completely divorced from their original roots?
Right. So in the context that I described, these kind of forces after World War II, where you have a more affluent American Jewish population, you have far fewer immigrants coming in, right? This is after the Holocaust. So there are some refugees who are coming in from Europe, but it's nowhere at the rate that it was in the late 19th and early 20th century. And there's this sort of moment of trying to kind of reinvent what philanthropy will mean, because it's so much the structure of American communal life.
Yes.
And at the same time, there is, and I already touched on this a little bit, some growing congressional suspicion about philanthropy, right? And, are these charitable entities potentially subversive? Might they be undermining what the interests of the American state are? And so you have these different kinds of forces, and Congress starts to make it clear that it's going to regulate philanthropy more, right? That it's kind of let too much laxity rule the sector. It's realizing that, there are kind of, these stores of money that have a lot of power, and that it needs to do some regulation. So throughout the 1950s and 60s, there's these various hearings about, what are the new laws going to be about philanthropy? And especially the heads of Jewish federations and especially their lawyers are paying a lot of attention to these hearings. And they've come to understand that it matters, right? They have the consciousness that I didn't really have until I started to study this, that in fact, this is very involved in the state, right? And that these hearings matter. And one of the things that seems to be on the horizon is that the kind of support that the state gives to philanthropy is going to change, and it might even weaken, right? And that there's going to be a kind of differentiation between more private-like philanthropy and more public-like philanthropy. And in thinking about the fact that, okay, so Congress is probably going to favor the more public-like philanthropy, right? If you're a university, if you're a religious organization, you're just going to be sort of dropped in this bucket of being public-minded. You're not going to have to prove it. Right. But if you're like, the Berman Family Foundation, you're like, no, we like the public, like prove it. And maybe pay some taxes on that, right? And maybe you're not going to get quite the same support. So it's in that landscape that certain tax attorneys, and one of them is this guy I became so interested in named Norman Sugarman, who was born in Cleveland, works for the Internal Revenue Bureau, which becomes the IRS for a while, and then becomes very involved in the Jewish Federation system. And he is brilliant and super savvy, and he understands what's happening. And he says, the more that we can get Jewish philanthropic money or otherwise philanthropic money into these publicly designated charities, the more that we're going to have control over that money, and we're going to have the benefits from the state. Right. And for him, this is a kind of philosophical issue in a way. I mean, he really believes that government doesn't have a right to manage what happens to charitable dollars. He wants the benefit, but he thinks that it's really not going to prove anybody if government starts to regulate. And he starts to kind of craft this idea that you could move money that would have maybe been in people's private family foundations into public charitable trusts or trust funds. People would immediately get to deduct the money, because once I give to the Silicon Valley Community Foundation, that is a charitable organization. I can deduct the money, and especially if I give appreciated securities, it's really good. And we can talk about why. And then that will be a fund that can be spent according to the advice of the donor. Now, in their historical form, I think it's really important. We think of them as operating in Fidelity and big commercials. They did not live there, right? They did tend to be local, geographically based community kinds of foundations or federations that started to have these funds. And many of them had certain kinds of rules. So if I gave to the New York Communal Fund, to the New York Jewish Communal Fund, I was expected to give a certain amount to Jewish organizations, and I was expected to pay out a certain amount. And there were rules to them. But and that money also, if it wasn't spent out, would eventually become just the corpus of that Jewish community fund or federation. But over time, these donor-advised funds developed really purely to be like private family foundations that get all the benefits of being categorized as public charitable structures. And that's where things, I think, get pretty tricky, to the point that about a third of the money now that's in the Jewish Federation system nationwide is actually made up of these donor advised funds.
Yeah, super. I mean, that history itself, I mean, for a philanthropy wonk is just so interesting. And I want to pick up now and move to some criticisms and provocations for us to consider, using some of the language you just had, Lila, which is about like the private foundation, private family foundation as a kind of more private facing philanthropic form, and the public charity or the donor advised trust as a more public facing form. So, you know, when I started researching the American charitable sector 10 years or so ago, one of the most surprising initial things I discovered, which ran contrary to all of my intuitions that I'd formed about what charity is that the largest recipient of charitable giving, ordinary forms of charitable giving in the US, is religious organizations. And these are not faith-based social service charities, you know, the Mercy Corps or Salvation Army or whatever it happens to be. These are just giving to the synagogue, the church, the mosque for the maintenance and support of the basic operation of the religious organization. So contrary to at least the history of the understanding of charity as something about almsgiving or assistance to the disadvantaged, which of course historically has been provided by religious organizations, but not only nowadays in the era of the modern state. Here's the provocation. Like, given that philanthropy to religious organizations is subsidized in the identical way from the standpoint of the tax incentives or tax benefits as giving to the soup kitchen is, or giving to the educational institution is, or giving to the art museum happens to be, the deduction structure doesn't differentiate amongst eligible 501c3 nonprofits into which churches, synagogues, mosques are all bundled. Why should we think that giving to support your own co-religionists, as academics would put it, or your fellow faith members for yourself, is a charitable activity at all? In other words, why not think of it as a kind of, in the language of an economist, a club good? It's like joining the exercise gym, and I get a benefit from hanging out at the gym with other people. I get healthier perhaps, and there's like indirect benefits to other people if I'm healthy. Why should Christians subsidize Jewish philanthropy and reciprocally Jews subsidize Christian philanthropy through the foregone tax revenue? What's going on there?
Absolutely. So I guess you don't think religion is a public good. So that, I mean, and that actually becomes part of the question, right? Like when we were talking about why it is that in the disestablishment of religion, the idea of an exemption initially for property was so important, it was because there was still that kind of trace of the idea of an established religion, right? That the religion was already, the church was already part of the state. It was already public. So you wouldn't tax it. It was on the public ledger, right? Of the side of the ledger. So, I think that part of what we see is a kind of holdover of that idea, even as we don't have a particularly, singularly established religion, the idea that religion is somehow still on the public side, right? Which, is a funny kind of wrinkle with how we think about the disestablishment of religion in this country. So one of the questions then you ask is like, are these things public goods? And what does that mean? And I thought it was so interesting. I found a piece that a bunch of Episcopalian clergy members and a few lawyers, who I think were also clergy, wrote in 1968. And they were saying, stop with this tax exemption thing. This is ridiculous. And part of it was like pulling out those ideas from, Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation, that it actually sullies religion. Right. If you have the state involved in this way, and that they really need to be separate. But, I think another question to ask about the exemption of whether it's religion or anything else is also, less the constitutional issue of separation of church and state and more the constitutional issue of equal protection.
Yep.
Right. So in other words, I'm okay if we're going to say any religious entity in this country gets an exemption. Yes. Maybe we could make an argument about diversity and, things that you write about, right? Yes. That actually this is good because there's something to the fabric of our civil society that is about allowing diverse groups to thrive, right? Yes. And that there is value in that. Okay, so say if we want to agree on that, but we also have to keep in mind the idea of equal protection. Mm-hmm. So we can do it if we're going to do it equally. Are we doing it equally?
Yep.
And as it turns out, we're really not.
Yeah.
Because, well, we have, a kind of theoretically and sometimes in practice progressive tax system whereby you earn more, you're taxed more.
That's
Deduction is the opposite.
Yes.
Right? When, dollar for dollar, if you are taxed at a higher tax bracket, when you give $1 to an organization and I give $1 to the same organization, you are paying less.
That's right.
Right. And then if you're also giving it to Donor-Advised Fund and you're giving your appreciated securities and not paying your capital gains, so then it becomes a real issue of equal protection.
Exactly.
Right? Like, why should your dollar be protected by the state in a way that mine is not? And
Yep.
I think that those are really important and valuable questions to ask. And we know that the tax code is a way that you can actually modify people's behavior. And so we should be thinking about, these issues of public good and of equal protection.
Yeah. All right, we've got about 5 more minutes before we shift to audience questions. And I've got 2 more questions I want to ask you, Lila. So one goes further into a potentially uncomfortable area. I'll call this the kind of Andir Dadas style question. So if anyone listening has read Andir Dadas's book, Winners Take All, The Elite Charade of Changing the World, he's a really amazing polemicist about how philanthropists attempt to reputation launder the kind of ills that they've done in their own money making in various ways, and in the same respect retain power over whatever change means. So if we can talk perhaps again in a provocative sense here about scoundrels and how philanthropy can be a mechanism to launder the reputation of a scoundrel in public. Well, you have a discussion of Bernie Madoff in the book, and I don't know enough of the details here other than having read a few news articles. So perhaps, I'll shift attention away from Madoff, who's sort of uncontroversially a scoundrel, to somewhere where it's a bit more controversial to label it as such. But, when I think of the news stories that came out about the Wexner family and Jeffrey Epstein, and the allegations made of the Wexner's businesses having to do with Me Too and a corporate culture not especially conducive for the flourishing of women. The Wexners are a famously philanthropic family in the world of American Judaism and beyond. What do you make of the kind of, I'll call it the Andir Dadas critique, that is, problems in the history of the money making can't and shouldn't be excused by whatever generosity there is in the philanthropic activity? And that, if I were to put it philosophically, I'd say something like, the point is, if I steal your watch, Lila, and then I go and sell it at the pawn shop for a couple $100 and give that money away to a super effective charity that next week, delivers a vaccine or saves a person's life, and you come to me and say, Rob, you stole my watch. And I say, yes, but look at the incredible good that has come from the money that I got from your watch. You would not say, well, then we're all good. I'm glad you made good use of the watch. You would say, I still owe some repair. And I think that's the spirit of the Andir Dadas critique is there's a repair that's owed to the harms that are done that isn't discharged by the philanthropic giving. So can I invite you to say a little bit about that if you wish to?
Yeah, it's interesting. From different interlocutors, a criticism I've gotten or sort of provocation is how come the word generosity really doesn't appear in the book, right? How can you write about philanthropy? How can you write about American Jewish philanthropy, which has been, so cataclysmic and so large and done so much good, and not talk about generosity? Yes. So one way I think about this is whether or not the givers are incredibly generous or incredibly not generous, whatever their individual intentions are, that might be interesting if I'm writing about a particular philanthropist.
Right.
But they're all operating in a structure, in a system, right? And, it seems to me that we lose something when we focus so much, whether it's the reputation laundering or it's, the awe of the person who takes a divorce settlement and now is giving it to so many different, charities or whatever it might be, right? That, we have a kind of celebrity culture about it, and I can understand that. But I think that actually blinds us to seeing how this system works, and that it is not separate from the incredible wealth inequality that we have in this country. As I was writing this history about American Jewish philanthropy, it was just strikingly evident the policies in the 1960s and 1970s that have to do with the deregulation of finance, that allow for an incredible amount of capital to really flow upward and to stay there, right? And the kind of clamping down on any kind of redistributive intention. And we know this from what happened under Reagan to tax rates, right? We know this from all sorts of other policies of deregulation. And so the way that philanthropy is working is very much along these same lines, right? Of growing and having more and more ability to sort of accumulate capital as opposed to circulate it, at the same time that all of these other kind of financialized policies are happening in American life. And so, the fact then that there are people like, whether it's Wexner or Madoff or Steinhardt or, any number of Gates, whatever, it doesn't have to be Jewish philanthropists, right? Who are then able to have this massive amount of wealth and use philanthropy, again, not really as a mechanism of redistribution, but as part of the same system of capital accumulation, not as the repair, but as, in fact, operating according to the same mechanism.
A legitimation story. Yes.
Absolutely. Yes. Like it ends up being much less about the individual and much more about the structure. And I do think that, I think that we as human beings sometimes have a hard time thinking in terms of structures. We relate to individuals. Yes. We think the things we're doing, and it doesn't mean, and I'm not just saying that we don't have agency. Right. And we do have to hold people accountable. And it's not enough that somebody gives away a lot of money and then they're okay. But I'll end here and say that Chiara Cordelli, is that how she says it? Cordelli. Okay. She has written a fabulous book called The Privatized State, and talks about how right now we don't have state mechanisms that are actually going to be doing the real work of taking care of everybody's needs and redistribution. And we do have all this money in philanthropy. And the answer really is that the way philanthropy needs to be working is with the intention of diminishing its power.
Right.
It has to be at the core of the repair that it does. And to me, that, and that means acting with the goals of democracy internally and externally in mind. It means not thinking about philanthropy as a form of perpetual power. And to me, that is really, an incredibly important insight.
Right. Well, that leads to the last question, and we can be brief here and then turn the floor over back to Shaul for audience Q&A. One of the things I found both moving and compelling in the early part of your book, Lila, was when you said, you entered into the research with a little bit of trepidation that you would write a book with the title that you gave it about Jewish philanthropy. And that you briefly thought the way to explore that, apropos the comment you just made, was by focusing on what you said in the prefaces on Jewish power, rather than the philanthropic or complex that then became the title. Can you say a little bit about how you came to the conclusion that you should have the courage to write the book you did in the face of worries about reinforcing stereotypes or giving succor to anti-Semitism, which is a completely important and reasonable concern for anyone to have?
Yeah, I still think about this, right? And, it's clear that we're living in a moment when there is a surge in anti-Semitism, and the, ideas about Jews and power and wealth and conspiracy remain a kind of available vocabulary.
Yes.
And available to understand why people feel disempowered, or why people feel victimized, or why people feel like they don't have control over the world in the way they want to have control. And this is, these various legends and tropes that remain an available vocabulary. And I think we see that. And, that obviously is scary to think about, and it's scary to think about writing something that could fuel any of those ideas. And I guess in my most hopeful moments, I thought, well, really what I'm doing though is pulling that apart. And the reason that I did not want to use terminology like Jewish power, right, as if there's this adjective of Jewish that modifies and creates a particular kind of power, is because I don't believe I'm talking about something that is in any sense sort of endemic or intrinsic to the Jews. Yeah. Right? I mean, there are historical reasons that put Jews in particular social locations at particular times, and there are policies of, the American state and American political economy, and these things interact in a relational contingent way. Yes. And we need to understand what those larger structures are. What are the policy decisions and the laws, and who is operating in a particular realm at a particular moment that allow this structure that is really hurting a lot of people, right? I think that many of us would agree that the economic climate that we live in now is quite harmful, right? And many of us actually maybe are seeing at this very moment, this COVID moment, that those things can change, yes, right? Like we suddenly have a government that has decided, to stop turning off public utilities for people, to stop evicting people, to giving people, an amount of money so that they can actually live. So we're actually seeing that these policies can change. And part of what I wanted this book to do is to show the ways that these structures operate. And yes, Jews are participating in them and they're agents in it, but this is not a particular form of Jewish power. This is about a kind of interaction with these American state structures and times when different decisions might be made and different policies could be pursued. But anytime you talk about Jews and money, there's a bit of a minefield. And, I was told in no uncertain terms and sometimes, yelled at that I needed to just, if I want to talk about Israel or Zionism or BDS or any hot button issue, you go ahead, but don't do this. Right. And I get the vulnerability because my historical actors felt it as well, I think.
Great. Let's turn the floor back to Shaul now for audience Q&A. Thanks, Lila, for the privilege of that exchange.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Hello, Lila. Hello, Rob. And so good to be here with you. Lila, congratulations. The book is an incredible contribution to scholarship, and it really just revolutionizes the way that we think about Jewish philanthropy, specifically by situating it in the context of not just American philanthropy, but the American state, which has essentially remained invisible until you helped to render it visible. So thank you for that. We have a lot of questions, and we're trying to synthesize some of them. First, let's actually take a step back, and you have written a book. It's published with Princeton University Press, a university academic press. You are sitting at a university. You're both sitting at universities. You have a named chair at your university. This event is sponsored by the Herbert D. Katz Center at the University of Pennsylvania. My Jewish Studies department does not have it is not a named Jewish Studies department. We don't have a donor who has contributed to name it, but I sit at Vanderbilt University, a one-time Methodist seminary that Cornelius Vanderbilt, who had no connection to Methodism himself except through marriage, gave a large bequest to. And the university was named. He was the wealthiest man in America at the time when he gave it. So I want to think about the context of knowledge production. And this question has been asked. I'll read it from Naama Rokem, who's one of the people who asked the question. And she writes that she's curious for both speakers, as academics, how do you think about the way that philanthropy shapes universities in the country? And specifically, Lila, how has it shaped Jewish studies as a field, both in relationship to universities as institutions, in relationship to Jewish communities, Jewish federations, Jewish foundations, and how does that play out then in the way that you were thinking about this as you were writing the book?
Rob, do you want to start by saying something general about, from where you sit, because you've studied education and philanthropy?
Sure. I'll make the general statement. only half in jest here, like tenure is good, is a good institutional arrangement for saying unpopular things. And, look at us biting the very hands that feed us at some level. I think there's no inconsistency in taking advantage of the freedom that academics get, partly through the institutional arrangement of tenure. Also to criticize, in my case, Stanford is one of the most successful, targets or receivers of philanthropic money in the United States. It raises over $1 billion at most years in the past decade, has a nearly $30 billion endowment. And while there is a bunch of philanthropy that I think goes to fund extremely important causes, public good production of knowledge, there's certainly philanthropy here and at most other universities that goes to support frills and a kind of arms race in the rock climbing gym and the quality of the dining hall and the dorms, which again, doesn't seem to deserve the same kind of status of a public good as giving to the soup kitchen. And when it goes along with the reputation boosts of your name on the wall, an extra advantage in the admissions process for your kids, people are right to wonder about whether or not this is a kind of complicated racket in which the wealthy get extra advantages. Not to mention then, Shaul, all the other things in the questioner's minds about the power of donors to shape the research agenda of those of us who are on the receiving end of things.
So I'll extend that a little bit, because I think that one of the problems is, if you're sitting at Stanford, you can start to think, okay, look, all of these private donors have decided that Stanford is a particularly valuable place and it produces particularly important knowledge. And so, yes, it is worth pumping into that $40 billion, whatever it is, endowment and just continuing to grow it because it more than anywhere else, deserves that kind of private support. But what is often invisible is that so much of that money is public money. It's publicly subsidized. It's that huge endowment that is not susceptible to any kind of taxation, right? And all the gifts that are given that are also given public support, all of the public money that goes there. And I think that we often forget that some of these entities that we think of as these, high echelons of really wonderful, kind of mobilization of private money for good public things, it's actually a lot of public money, right? And so we are, in a place that tends not to trust the public much, doesn't trust government much, doesn't trust the state much. And yet, these structures that are supported by it, we don't even see that. And so I think that's one piece of really needing to understand why it's important to make all of these forces of private philanthropy more transparent, to understand how the state and the government and tax dollars are actually part of this. Right? We should all feel good about Stanford's endowment or something, or maybe it should be taxed. So that's one thing. And as for the question about Jewish studies and the history of Jewish studies in the university, absolutely. This is a story of private funding creating these programs. And there's a lot of good, I think, that has come out of that, or at least, I have benefited from the fact that there were these private donors who decided to invest their money in this way and in this kind of knowledge production. But there's also a kind of difficult structure then that exists, right? Where, first of all, the more that I think universities have seen Jewish studies programs as a sort of pet projects of private donors, the less that universities have thought that those are programs that they should invest in. And I think we sometimes see the problems of that. And the kind of flip side of it is that particular donors, and whether or not, these are donors who actually gave to support that program, or they're, simply Jewish communal institutions, start to feel like they should be able to call the shots over what happens in those programs. They see them as kinds of extensions of the community. And the university sees them as that as well, because they understand that these are potential places to really generate donations and to generate donor dollars. And so there's a funny kind of investment and disinvestment in these kinds of programs. And I think that in a certain way, this is more provocative than I mean it to be, but it has stunted Jewish studies. And I think that we sometimes see the ways in which this particular kind of capital arrangement has stunted the field.
Thank you. We have a number of questions that actually may be beyond the scope of the study. You did a study. This is the Jewish American Philanthropic Complex, but we have questions that are asking you to comment cross-nationally with comparison cases. This is American tax code is American tax code, American law is American law. Did you have a chance in the course of the research to look at how things are organized in other countries? And what are you seeing there? How does that inform your understanding of what's happening in the States? And what can we learn from that?
So I'll just mention two things that were interesting to me. One is, and I'm actually not sure, maybe Rob knows if this is still the current practice, but I was interested in how other countries kind of deal with ideas of exemption and philanthropy. And I recall reading, and it was very eye-opening to me, that in England, if I want to give $100 to Planned Parenthood, right? Instead of actually writing that $100 check, I would write a check, say, for $70, and then the government would send $30 to Planned Parenthood, right? And I think that may still be the case. And that to me was just eye-opening, that that's a different, almost pedagogical tool. That's telling me, okay, yeah, you've decided that this is a particular public good that's important to you, and you want to spend a certain amount of your money. And let's be honest and plain about how much of your money you're spending. And let's be honest and plain about how much of the government's money is being spent. And I thought that was really illuminating, that even, and as teachers, we know that sometimes the same exact thing, but sort of said it a different way or packaged a different way, can have such a different impact on one's intellectual sense of what's happening. So that was very interesting to me. And then the other thing that's been really interesting to me is that in Israel, there has historically been much less of a sort of robust, civil society philanthropic sector. And that one of the things that American Jewish philanthropists have been trying to export to Israel is a more robust philanthropic sector. In fact, Israel has just started some donor-advised funds. And I recall some conversations with Israelis about this who were irate and who were saying, we have a more socialized state and we have a social welfare state, and we know what that means. We know what it means when you try to build out this kind of philanthropic sector. We've read Philanthrocapitalism, and we don't want that. We think that's really scary, right? And then, on the other hand, others who were saying, no, this is about kind of the modernization, and this is about moving Israel into the ability to, maybe foster more pluralism and more diversity. When you have this big, strong state that is provisioning all the social welfare responsibilities, it also tends to kind of narrow certain ideas of diversity and pluralism. So that was also something that's really interesting to me in that kind of comparative vein.
Great, thanks. And Rob, do you have insight into the international scene on this that can inform as well?
Yeah, the question of sort of comparative policy arrangements, I think, is an essential one. I'll make one general remark and then a couple of particular observations. The general remark is that I came to the conclusion in my own research that the human inclination to perform other regarding or altruistic activities is universal, and that the disposition of humans to help each other, to put it really colloquially, cuts across time and space. And the reason why the charitable or philanthropic sector looks differently in different countries has nothing to do with human nature being different, but everything to do with the policy structures that shape and give incentives and disincentives to this universal inclination to give or to help. So in other countries, just as Lila mentioned, the UK, that the mechanism you were pointing to, Lila, is called gift aid. So you don't get any personal tax benefit. You don't reduce your own tax burden by making a charitable contribution, although you do diminish the total amount that goes to the treasury or the exchequer. So we collectively subsidize any person's donation, but it doesn't come as a personal financial benefit in sheltering your own income or wealth from taxes. Other countries do it with a mechanism that I myself favor, which is a tax credit rather than a tax deduction. a tax credit of equal amount to every individual. So Bill Gates gets $1,000 tax credit, I get $1,000 tax credit, the state is treated equally insofar as it's providing us an incentive to give. And after that, each of us continue giving if we wish. But the current upside down nature of the tax deduction really does amplify the voices of the wealthy and their own preferences in giving against the voices and preferences of everybody else. Different countries, often people say the United States is the most generous people when it comes to giving. It's also by far and away the most generous when it comes to tax incentivizing or tax subsidizing philanthropy, which is to say we forego every year nearly $60 billion in revenue just from the tax deduction structure alone. That doesn't count tax exemption or other forms of tax, tax advantages that attach to different forms of philanthropy or charity.
So we have, I'm seeing names in the chat, and we have people coming from academia. We have people who are working in the philanthropic space, and we have a question from one who says, I work in the endowment space that encourages Jewish nonprofits to build endowment funds to secure their financial futures. Are you suggesting that this is not a good idea?
So I think in the structure in which we are operating now, it is a good idea. Right? If you are an institution and you want to put yourself in the most advantageous capital position, if you can get a donor to endow you, then you're going to benefit a great deal, as will the donor, gain particular benefits. So I can understand, given the circumstances in which we are operating, why this is something that is pursued. However, I think that one of the real problems with this kind of race for endowments is that what is an endowment really about? It's about holding or warehousing as much capital as possible. And then there's generally some kind of spending rule, right? And in a sort of arbitrary way, it's often like 5%, right? And, especially if you're on the public side of that charitable split, you're not told you have to spend a certain amount or you can, only spend a certain amount, but it ends up leaving a huge amount of money kind of on the sidelines or just simply in the investment economy. And insofar as we are thinking about philanthropy as possibly a way that democracy can be strengthened, which I think is part of the kind of philosophy of what philanthropy is sort of meant to be in this country on some level. These practices of endowment are actually operating sort of contrary to that. And that I think is a structural problem. So it's not necessarily a problem that an individual nonprofit can solve. But there are things I think that are worth thinking about, right? So, if an institution is making the decision that it would rather make sure that it can exist in perpetuity, which theoretically is what an endowment does, as opposed to that it can spend the money it's taking in on present day problems, it's making a calculation, right? And, I was really interested to learn about something called the Jewish Future Pledge, which was something that a couple of different Jewish philanthropists sort of came up with together, that Jews should designate 50% of their charitable estates to this Jewish Future Pledge, that money will be spent on things having to do, I think the language is Jewish values and or the state of Israel, right? And the idea, and they say this could potentially capture like $600 billion because there's this massive wealth transfer that's going to happen. And this is really about making the decision that there's some future that needs this capital and that it should be sort of sewn up in these structures more than a particular present. And, I think that is in part a calculation that we need to at least consider what it means, right? So to pick on Stanford again, right? And I don't know if 40 billion is right. I'm just sort of pulling that out. 30 something billion?
A mere 30. Okay,
30 billion. I'm sorry, I gave you 10 billion extra, right? So, so Stanford is deciding that it should be holding on to $30 billion in endowment. And that there is like something in the future, some reason that money needs to be there. There's a decision being made that money is not necessary for things that might be urgent problems today, right? And, one could imagine a change in tax code saying, actually, if you hold an endowment over X, you need to pay some kind of taxation on that. And maybe that money would go to the community college, industry that actually educates the vast majority of American students, right? So, it's not that I'm saying that if you're a nonprofit, you need to just, drop endowment, but it needs to be thought about in this larger structure, thinking about inequality and thinking about what makes democracy work and what harms democracy.
Can I add just one small thing to that, which is thinking a bit more practically here as well. So especially speaking to the questioner who works in a nonprofit organization, perhaps trying to build an endowment. Just as Lila said, that within the current kind of structure or the dynamic we live in, that it makes sense to try to build an endowment. But part of that is also, I think, a response to the increasingly frequent strings that donors attach to their ordinary forms of giving. The donor is the wiser one who imposes sort of paternalistically on the recipient organization the really good things that the organization should be doing. And instead of then being directed by an assortment of donor whims and projects, if you can get endowment funding, well, then you're in principle freed up to do what you want with the spend out from the endowment. And you still can have the string attached in what the endowment is permitted to fund, but endowments are more often for general operating support than for very narrow purposes. And very narrow purposes in an era in which philanthropy and philanthropists are the wiser ones in our sector, the ones who impart their market-won knowledge and winnings onto the nonprofit sector in a kind of, further extension of market norms. I think that's, one other reason to resist the paternalistic actions of philanthropists is to try to build space for giving up on endowments to spend more money, but donors then have to trust the organizations to do with it what they want rather than what the donor wants.
How then, and this is one of the question that's related, how then do spend down philanthropies fit into your analysis?
Right. So I think that this is an interesting, I've given a lot of thought actually, because as I was writing this, there were a few important Jewish foundations that were making the decisions to spend down, frankly, in part because of 2008, right? In part because of Bernie Madoff and in part because of the subprime crisis, that, they weren't going to be able to continue the way that they might have hoped to. So there's like a few things that I've been thinking about. One thing is that, especially I'll speak specifically about kind of the Jewish world, there's so many different institutions that become so dependent on philanthropy, right? It's absolutely their lifeblood. They wouldn't be able to pay their employees, JCCs, maybe Jewish community centers wouldn't be able to exist. And there's such a kind of difficult dynamic of a lack of accountability, right? So, if there was an institution, a big Jewish family foundation that was supporting X project, and X project thought it was really valuable and it was getting great support from this family foundation, and it didn't really think that that was going to go away. And then suddenly the family foundation says, yeah, actually, we're going to spend down, we don't need this, or we don't want this anymore, or we can't afford it anymore, whatever the case might be. There's absolutely nothing, there's no leverage that the different institutions that had so dependent on it could, that they have. And it's the same with a particular program. A philanthropic organization might decide, this year we're going to take a break from this program. And that's that. They can do it. And so, I think that there is a way in which these kinds of spending habits can be very mercurial, right? And it makes it really hard for the institutions that feel dependent on them to really necessarily plan or to have any sense of like what their future might be. So I think that's within American Jewish life, that can be a really complicated problem and dilemma. There can be organizations that are thriving one minute, and then if that funding is pulled away from them, that's that, right? And they're at the whim of that. The other thing that I think is interesting about spend down is, in theory, it's about the circulation of the capital. So I think that, in theory, there's something that's right about kind of pushing that capital out and making sure not to warehouse it. But But I think part of the question is, and I think about this with the Give While You Live pledges and some of these other mechanisms, is, what kind of new power can be sort of used at that moment? And if, unless there's a sense of using that big kind of outpouring of capital as a way to think about how to give more leverage to various publics, there's a way in which I think spend down policies sometimes make people kind of more vulnerable in a way to the way that power operates through philanthropy. So, I think that one thing there was, when Congress was thinking of regulating philanthropy in the 1950s and 1960s, actually Al Gore's father suggested that there should be a time limit on all family foundations, that they should only be allowed to exist for about 25 years. And I think that there's something interesting to thinking about that, right? That maybe if there's a way to sort of plan for time limitations, then that could allow for more of that capital to be circulated, but also in a way that is not whimsical feeling.
Some great thinking coming out of Tennessee. You have written about structures, and you have individuals in there, tax attorneys and the like. There are major philanthropists who have reshaped the structures that they were working in. We have questions, and I'm seeing names like Adelson and Bronfman, and questions also about the politics of philanthropy, when the politics are not, in the term that you're using, depoliticized, but when the politics are placed front and center. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, this was a whole part of the book that became really interesting to me, that as American Jewish philanthropy sort of builds broader institutions, and especially in that post-war period, is able to kind of assert itself as having the ability to raise significant capital and to change and be part of discussions about changing state structures in terms of how philanthropy operates. It gains a certain kind of political power. And it was interesting for me to observe various men, it was basically all men, who were able to use the kind of fundraising power that they had convened in American Jewish spaces to then translate that into having the ability to kind of gain political access. And so there was a guy named Max Fisher who was born in Ohio and then had his career in Michigan, in Detroit, who became really important to the Nixon administration. And I was able to sort of trace in his papers and correspondence the ways that he was able to raise significant dollars for Nixon and for the Republican Party by kind of working with the contacts and the structures that he had built to raise money within American Jewish life. And this is not just a Republican phenomenon. It happens also among important Jewish Democratic philanthropists and donors as well. So, I think that there is this way, and it's only surprising if you think that somehow philanthropy and the American state are separate, right? But when you understand that this is a kind of mode and demands a certain kind of language and fluency that really is tied up into American politics and American kind of economic policy, it makes sense that there's this kind of closeness. But there's also a way in which, and I think we see this with somebody like Adelson, everybody knows, where Adelson stood politically, right? He was not trying to hide that. But the way that his philanthropic gifts in the American Jewish world were used was sort of meant to neutralize that politics somehow, right? And so, he supported a program like Birthright that Shaul has written really brilliantly about, right? A program to send young American Jews to Israel on this free 10-day trip. So he gave a huge amount of the support for a program like that. And there was a way in which, they talk about kind of laundering in a way, right? That money became sort of put into this kind of neutral political space. But it's also the case that, he was able to convene quite a bit of power, both in American Jewish life and in American political life, because of the way that he used his kind of philanthropic influence. So, I think that it's really important to kind of keep your eye on all of these different forces in order to understand the kind of role that philanthropy has played in the kind of political constellation of American Jewish life.
Great. Rob, do you have anything you'd like to add on that?
No, let's go to the next question.
Okay, so there's a question about the federation system, the rise of the federation system, and the ability of one umbrella group to essentially choose the agencies that are deserving of funding. And I want to take that question and add to it, because you're also describing a change in power relations between federations, between private foundations. And when you think about the ability of different types of philanthropic systems to both to marshal resources to do collective action, but also to support a diverse array of programmings, is there a difference that you're seeing in the federation system versus the foundation system? Foundation system is unaccountable, but you can get much more funding on the right and on the left and on the extremes, whereas everything has to be funneled through a federation, has to go through consensus, so it chops that off, but it's coercive. How do you make sense of that?
Right, like, so sometimes folks who would write about the difference between sort of federation world and foundation would apply a similar analysis to, the idea that federation was like the government and foundation was like the individual, right? So like federation took care of making sure that like the lights turned on and the basic needs were met. And then foundations could be kind of risk takers and, kind of try out sexier projects and take more risks. And while I think that there is some wisdom to that, in a sense, because so much of the contours of federation started to be shaped by endowments and by donor-advised funds and by these kinds of private, restricted, donor-driven kinds of funds, I actually think the difference is much less great than people have sort of presumed it to be. And one of the times that this was like really brought home to me is there's a particular big American Jewish private family foundation that gives a lot of money to all sorts of different groups, and I couldn't I was looking through the 990s, the tax forms, and just trying to trace like where the money was going. And this family happens to have made a lot of its wealth in Canada and keeps money in Canada. And I was trying to just piece together what was happening. And it ends up that most of the gifts of this foundation that many people would recognize go through a particular donor advised fund held at Brandeis University, right? And so, it's going through a kind of public charity. It has to be Brandeis because it's Canadian money, and you can give Canadian money without tax penalties to Brandeis because there are X percentage of Canadians who go to Brandeis, right? Some interesting maneuver, which was not untoward necessarily, right? But it's just to say that, somehow the idea that these federations are, just taking care of the business, this down the middle mainstream of what the community needs, is really being quite myopic and quite blind to the fact that there are all these other kinds of financial vehicles that are being held under the auspices of federations or Jewish community foundations, and are supporting those federations and Jewish community foundations because they can take some fees and whatever else. But that the money is being given in the name of those community foundations or federations to all sorts of projects that would not necessarily be perceived as down the middle. So whether or not it's projects that are supporting efforts that are happening beyond the Green Line in Israel, projects that are supporting organizations in some cases that I'm aware of that are on the Southern Poverty Law Center's list of hate organizations, right? There was a case in San Francisco that money for an organization called Canary Mission was, being funneled through San Francisco's federation. So it ends up that because of this financial logic, that difference is actually, I think, less profound than people tend to think of it.
We have time for one more question. There are a number of questions here asking for your thoughts about solutions. And I want to ask each of you to respond. I know, Rob, you've given us a little bit with tax credits. What innovative philanthropic structures or policies, laws have you seen that are emerging that can change things for the better? Is there a preferred positive role for philanthropy in a democratic society?
Shall I start so Lila gets the last word? Is that okay? All right. Well, yeah, I already said something about replacing the tax deduction with a kind of tax credit. I also think that with respect to the creation of private foundations, perpetuity should be eliminated, and we should have legal requirements for spend down. In addition to perpetuity having the issues we discussed before, it represents the dead hand of the donor, constraining future generations forever, an opportunity to live eternally and thereby insights of future generations to solve problems on their own. I'm going to make a plea as the last thing I'll say constructively, to see time horizons, having now discussed perpetuity, as an important dimension of thinking about the distinctive role that philanthropy can and in my view should play in a democratic society. The current operation of the marketplace tends to harness private capital towards relatively short time horizon returns on investment. And democracy is itself a political arrangement that, through the establishment of periodic elections, also harnesses decision-making to relatively short time horizons. Democracy is a fantastic kind of technology, if you will, for social problem solving that establishes each of us as an equal citizen. But its social problem solving or decision making are arrayed across relatively short time horizons. So the role that I think philanthropy can and should play is a kind of longer term social problem solving approach that is nevertheless a kind of humble orientation to what is needed in a democratic society. That's what I've written as the most important role it can play. And I'll add one final thing that maybe this, this very seminar is one small example of, but in my view, the price that we ought to attach as a society to the extraordinary permissions afforded to philanthropists, permissions both in the form of the donor discretion to fund the projects they wish, and often the tax advantages that go along with it, is that we should insist upon much greater forms of transparency, legal demands of communicating publicly what philanthropic strategies are, how it is that you can contact potential donors to learn more about the strategy, and then feedback loops to help donors learn to improve. And the mechanism to do that seems to me that we need journalists and ordinary citizens to scrutinize the activity of philanthropists rather than engaging in what I think is too frequently a default or mode of gratitude. The donor shows up and, in the university setting, in the nonprofit setting, the donor is always smarter, wiser, and funnier than anyone else in the room. There's genuflecting before the generosity of the donor, rather than asking hard questions as a citizenry or as a recipient about what the donor's plans are and how they wish to try to make good with the money. So a posture of scrutiny first, rather than gratitude first, would be a really healthy change to the norms of philanthropy here in this country.
Great, thank you. Lila.
I endorse all of it. And I'll say one or two things that are very specific, I think, to thinking about American Jewish philanthropy. And I think about naming a lot. And it's because I think, in the world I grew up, I was raised in a, Jewish home, and we went into lots of Jewish organizations, and I would sit there and read the walls and read the plaques and see all the names, and, it was fascinating to me. And, I think of all of these different foundations and these individual names that carry so much of the weight of what the community is and carry so much of the shape of it. And sometimes I've carried those names, right, in my titles and in fellowships I've held. And I wonder, along those same lines of what the UK does for taxation, what if there was more insistence that people think about not naming these entities after themselves? Right. And what if, it could be a time-bound thing for a certain amount of time. Okay, you can name it yourself. But that, what if there was a real sense that after a period of time, that money would sort of spin off to larger and larger circles of decision making, right? That a larger kind of circle of we could be part of it, that it was no longer the Lila, Corwin, Berman, family foundation that attached her name onto this, that, and the other thing. And so, I think about that, and I think about all sorts of other practices, even within the structure right now, right? Because, I want the revolution in so many of the ways that would really change this and would really change tax code. But even in the structure we have now, if more entities, Jewish philanthropic entities, signed on to more of the ideas of democratic and participatory grant making, right? If there's a problem you're trying to solve, to really involve communities in thinking about that, and to not only say, hey, we'll interview you or we'll give you a little seat, one seat at the table, but to say, we're involving you because we know this is in part your money, right? And we want you there, and we want you to think about how this money is going to be spent. And, we're trying to, again, to sort of try to spread out that decision-making power. I think that could help. I think more robust boards with more voices on them could help. So there are smaller things as well that really could change the culture from the inside, and would start to make some of those changes on the structural level and on the policy level seem more possible, right? Because I think the problem is we feel so dependent on this money that why would we try to change the structure, even when we know sometimes that there's a lot that's not working about it. So those are some of the kinds of changes. And the last thing I'll say, because I know we have to end, is that along the lines of journalism, I think that we all, as part of this system, as part of this public, need to educate ourselves about it. And I feel as if I was woefully ignorant about it. And obviously sort of went way to the deep end on the other side to try to learn as much as I could. I'm not suggesting everybody needs to do that. But I think that the more that we expect that transparency that Rob talked about, and the more that we make it our business to educate ourselves about philanthropy, right? And not just laud it or not just decry it, but actually educate ourselves about it, I think the more feasible it will be that we can use this as a lever to really working on allowing for more of a sense of equality, more of a sense of a public that feels enfranchised, that feels like its vision and its ideas are being enacted by this sector.
Well, Lila, you are helping to educate us all, and we thank you for it. Lila, Rob, thank you very, very much for the conversation, for the dialogue, for the contributions, and for the learning. To everyone who participated, you can catch the recording both at the CAT Center website, and we will link to it as well from Vanderbilt Jewish Studies. Thank you, everyone, and have a good night.
Thank you.